Hi and welcome to another edition of Podcasting Made Easy. My name is Steve Hart and here I am with my $20 mic recording for these podcasts, which I think is great. I want to talk today about interviewing people, the all-important interview. Sooner or later, as a podcaster, you're going to get tired of your own voice and you might want to spice things up a little bit by interviewing someone and having a guest on your show. For podcasters, it's kind of, once a week or maybe once a month, you might get to interview someone, and it can be a bit daunting unless you're kind of doing it regularly. So here are a few tips on how to handle that first interview. First off, do a deep dive on your guest. Obviously, they're probably going to send you their bio, so you get their CV, and obviously you can look them up online. So do as much research as you can to really get a hand on who these people are, where they've come from, what they've done to get to where they are today. And that way you've got some insight into who they are, and you can start to think about some really interesting questions. Also, if they've appeared in other people's podcasts, well, listen to those as well. And it's great to hear what questions and answers that appear in that podcast, but start to think about the questions that weren't answered, or if a question was asked but the answer didn't come. Frequently the case, a question is asked and then the guest will say, "That's a great question, I love that question, but," and then they go on a completely different tangent, avoiding the question. So listen out for those and bring them into the mix for your interview. Now, when preparing your questions, do have some strategy behind them. Decide where you want the interview to go. Try not to let it just organically grow and develop and morph into some odd direction where it's all over the show. You want a clear path and a clear set of questions to take the interview forward to the conclusion or the expectations of your listeners. So there's some direction to the interview. It's not just a completely fluff piece. And talking of fluff pieces, I think if we're honest with ourselves, 99 times out of 100, when a guest comes on a podcast, it's going to be a pretty soft interview, isn't it? You're not going to ask really tough questions that's going to be a gotcha question or a gotcha moment and put your guests on the spot. Because if you're doing a podcast about a particular niche area, then that guest is going to be within that niche area and this one happy family type thing. But also you do want to make it interesting and give your listeners something a bit different and special to listen to. Now, the golden trick to asking any questions is to avoid the yes and no answer. So, for example, a rock climber, was you scared when you fell? Yes, I was. Okay. Rather than say, ask a question with a yes or no answer, which can make for a very dull interview. Particularly if the guest is a bit nervous and they don't really want to answer much and it's hard going. So rather than ask, were you scared when you fell? Ask, what was going through your mind as the rope started to slacken off and you began to fall 30 feet to the ground? What was going through your mind? And now you're going to get an interesting answer. Who knows what went through their mind when whatever it was happening, but you're going to find out with that kind of question. And of course, when the answers come, listen very carefully. You may have done lots of research and you may have read their book that you're interviewing them about. You may have listened to the music that they're being interviewed about. Whatever it is, you've done your research, and that's great. And that research has helped you formulate a set of questions, but they're just the base, really. You don't need to ask all those questions. You don't need to ask those questions in the order you've prepared them. But the key thing is that having asked the question, listen to the answer. Listen to the answer, really listen, because within that answer could be a great follow-up question. And I've heard it lots of times in interviews. The interviewer has asked a pre-prepared question, they've got a really interesting answer, and I thought, wow, what happened next then? And then the interviewer's gone next onto the list and asked the next question, which has got nothing to do with what we just heard. So you must listen to the interviewee rather, hear what they say, listen to what they say, and think, is there a follow-up question in here? Shall we take this interview in a bit of a different direction? You can always come back to your list, but it's okay to go off on a bit of a tangent if they said something that's really interesting. So do listen very carefully to what your interviewee says. Silence is kind of a killer in a way, but it's a very powerful tool. So you could ask a question and you listen to the answer in silence. Try not to interrupt people when they speak, because the people are listening to the interview to hear what your guest has to say, not that you are as clever as they are. Okay, so don't even try to go. My advice is ask a question and stay silent, because you could interrupt a very, very good answer and suddenly you've spoilt it. So listen in silence. When the interviewee finishes answering the question, just kind of count to 3 or 4 in your head. Who's going to break the silence first? Are you going to break it with another question, or will your interviewee feel they need to fill the silence with something and then expand on that answer that they've just given you and say something really, really fascinating, because there's silence. And people don't like silence. But as the interviewer, you've got the power. You ask the question, stay silent, let them finish the answer, and stay silent. And see what they do next. You can do it once or twice in the interview and see how you get on. It often, almost always leads to something very interesting happening. Silence is excellent. Now, while your interview may start off with some very soft questions and you kind of go into perhaps some more interesting territory later on, do end it on a positive note by saying, I don't know, what advice would you give your younger self? What advice would you give to people entering your industry today? Because particularly if you're talking with someone who's much older, who's had a lot of experience in the industry, but boy, with all the technology that's changing, all the automation that's coming in, not only machinery, but with computers as well, and AI and all the rest of it, every industry is changing. So when I first started in radio years ago, it was pretty easy. There was no automation, and it was records and CDs, and people had to turn up to the station to do stuff. Now you can do it remote, and you can pre-record sections. It's, I'm kind of going off in a bit of a tangent there, but my point is that the person you're interviewing may be a bit old school like me, but what advice have they got for people coming into the industry today? And that would be very interesting. What advice would they give their younger self is also a great question. And there's nothing wrong with saying at the end of the interview, when it's all done and dusted, is there anything else you'd like to add? It's a bit of a kind of a junior reporter type question where it's a bit of a sign that the interviewer hasn't completely done their homework and are not really sure if they've missed anything. And so they say to the interviewee, is there anything else you'd like to add? And 9 times out of 10, they'll probably come out with some little golden nugget, or they'll say, no, I've said everything I needed to say, and it's been a great interview, thank you very much, in which case you've done your job. But do give them a bit of an option to add anything. You can always cut it into the interview in some other way. One other thing I see interviewers do, even so-called professional interviewers on TV and radio, they make this classic mistake, and I see it and hear it again and again and again. It really annoys me, is that the interviewer will say to the interviewee, but they will basically wrap up 3 questions in one go. So, for example, an interviewee is interviewing someone, and they say, so when you tripped up over the steps, what was going through your mind? And didn't you fall over on a bus the other week? And weren't you at a party last night? And did you get drunk? So that's kind of 3 questions in one. You kind of see where I'm going. And basically the interviewee then has an option which question they're going to choose to answer. So 1 question, 1 answer. Is that right? You tripped up over the steps last night, leaving the so-and-so pub? I know obviously that's a silly question, okay, but I'm just trying to rack my brains as to illustrate how 3 questions can be wrapped up into 1 question, and they might choose none of them when they give you the answers. So a few tips there on handling an interview. Do your research, ask good questions, ask one question at a time, don't forget the silence, and ask them if they've got anything else to add, and edit the podcast in a nice way to make it all flow. If you have any questions about making podcasts or anything to do with interviewing people, that kind of thing, do let me know. You can leave a question in the comments below, or flick me an email via my website, stevehartmedia.com. Okay, have yourself a nice week. I'll see you next time around on Podcasting Made Easy.